Rashomon, by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. It was toward evening one day. A servant stood beneath Rashomon Gate, waiting for the rain to stop. Under the broad gate, there was no one but him. A single cricket perched on one of the great round pillars, where the vermilion paint had peeled away in patches. Since Rashomon stood on Suzaku Avenue, one might have expected to find 2 or 3 other people sheltering there from the rain, a woman in a traveling hat, perhaps, or a man in a soft black cap. Yet there was no one but him. For the past 2 or 3 years, Kyoto had been struck by one disaster after another: earthquakes, whirlwinds, fires, and famine. The devastation throughout the capital was extraordinary. Old chronicles record that Buddhist images and ritual objects were smashed, and the wood, still bearing red paint or gold and silver leaf, was piled by the roadside and sold as firewood. With the city in such a state, naturally no one gave a thought to repairing Rashomon. Foxes and badgers made their dens in the ruins. Thieves moved in. At last, people even began bringing unclaimed corpses to the gate and abandoning them there. Once daylight faded, everyone shunned the place, repelled by its horror. Instead, crows came flocking from somewhere in great numbers. By day, countless birds could be seen wheeling and crying around the tall ornamental ridge ends. When the sky above the gate reddened at sunset, they stood out as clearly as sesame seeds scattered across it. The crows came, of course, to peck at the flesh of the corpses in the upper chamber. Today, perhaps because the hour was late, not a single one could be seen. Only their droppings remained, clinging in white specks to the 7 stone steps, which had crumbled here and there and sprouted long grass from their cracks. The servant sat on the highest step, the seat of his washed-out indigo robe beneath him. Fingering a large pimple on his right cheek, he stared vacantly at the falling rain. The author has just written that the servant was waiting for the rain to stop. But even if it stopped, he had no particular place to go. Ordinarily, of course, he would have returned to his master's house. But his master had dismissed him 4 or 5 days earlier. As already noted, Kyoto was then in a state of exceptional decline. The servant's dismissal after many years of service was merely one small consequence of that decline. It would therefore be more accurate to say not that the servant was waiting for the rain to stop, but that a servant trapped by the rain, with nowhere to go, was at a loss. The weather that day also had no small effect on the sentimentality of this Heian period servant. The rain, which had begun late in the hour of the monkey, showed no sign of letting up. And so, trying above all to find some way to live through the next day, trying, in other words, to do something about a situation beyond remedy, he had been following one aimless thought after another while half listening to the rain on Suzaku Avenue. The rain enveloped Rashomon, gathering from afar into a steady roar. Dusk pressed the sky lower and lower. When one looked up, the gate's roof seemed to support the heavy, darkening clouds on the tips of its slanting tiles. To do something about the impossible, there was no time to be particular about the means. If he remained particular, he would merely starve beneath an earthen wall or on the dirt beside the road. Then his body would be brought up into this gate and thrown away like a dog's. If he refused to be particular, after circling the same ground again and again, the servant's thoughts had at last reached this point. Yet his if remained only an if. Though he accepted that he could no longer choose his means, he still lacked the courage to take the inevitable next step and affirm that he had no choice but to become a thief. The servant gave a tremendous sneeze, then rose wearily to his feet. The evening chill in Kyoto was already sharp enough to make one long for a brazier. Wind and darkness swept unhindered between the gate's pillars. The cricket that had perched on the vermilion pillar had gone somewhere else. Hunching his neck and raising the shoulders of his indigo robe over the yellow undergarment beneath it, the servant looked around the gate. He hoped to find a place free from wind and rain, hidden from human eyes, where he could sleep comfortably for the night. Fortunately, he noticed a broad vermilion ladder leading to the chamber above the gate. Even if anyone was up there, they could only be dead. Taking care that the sword at his waist did not slip from its scabbard, he placed one straw-sandaled foot on the lowest rung. Several minutes later, a man crouched like a cat halfway up the broad ladder to Rashomon's upper chamber, holding his breath as he watched what was happening above. Firelight from the chamber faintly washed his right cheek, the cheek with the red, pus-filled pimple among its short whiskers. From the beginning, the servant had assumed that only the dead would be above. But after climbing 2 or 3 rungs, he realized that someone had lit a fire there and seemed to be moving it from place to place. He knew this at once from the way a murky yellow light trembled across the underside of the roof, where cobwebs hung in every corner. Anyone tending a fire atop Rashomon on such a rainy night could hardly be an ordinary person. Silencing his footsteps like a gecko, the servant crept to the top of the steep ladder. Flattening his body as much as he could and stretching his neck forward, he cautiously peered inside the chamber. As rumor had said, several corpses lay carelessly abandoned inside. But the fire illuminated a smaller area than he had expected, so he could not tell how many there were. He could only make out, dimly, that some bodies were naked and others still clothed, and that men and women appeared to be mixed together. All the corpses lay sprawled across the floor, mouths open and arms outstretched like figures molded from clay, so much so that one might doubt they had ever been living people. The vague firelight touched the raised surfaces of shoulder and breast, deepening the shadows in the hollows below, while the bodies kept in eternal silence. The servant instinctively covered his nose against the stench of the rotting corpses. A moment later, however, he had forgotten even to do that. A powerful emotion had almost entirely robbed him of his sense of smell. Only then did his eyes discover a living figure crouched among the corpses. It was a short, thin, white-haired old woman with the look of a monkey, dressed in a robe the brown of cypress bark. In her right hand she held a burning splinter of pine and was peering into the face of one of the bodies. Judging by its long hair, the corpse was probably a woman's. Moved by 6 parts fear and 4 parts curiosity, the servant forgot to breathe for a time. To borrow the words of an old chronicler, he felt as if every hair on his head and body stood on end. The old woman thrust the burning pine splinter between the floorboards. Then, laying both hands on the neck of the corpse she had been examining, she began pulling out its long hairs one by one, just as a mother monkey picks lice from her young. The hair seemed to come away easily beneath her fingers. As each hair came out, the servant's fear gradually disappeared. At the same time, a fierce hatred of the old woman began to rise within him. No, perhaps it is misleading to say that his hatred was directed at her. Rather, his revulsion toward every form of evil grew stronger with each passing minute. Had someone then put before him once more the choice he had considered beneath the gate, starvation or theft, he would probably have chosen starvation without the slightest hesitation. His hatred of evil had flared up as fiercely as the pine splinter the old woman had wedged into the floor. The servant naturally had no idea why the old woman was pulling hair from the dead. By reason alone, he could not have decided whether her act was good or evil. But to him, pulling hair from a corpse atop Rashomon on this rainy night was in itself an unforgivable evil. He had, of course, entirely forgotten that only moments earlier he himself had been considering becoming a thief. Planting his feet, the servant suddenly sprang from the ladder into the chamber. One hand on the sword at his waist, he strode toward the old woman. Needless to say, she was startled. The instant she saw him, the old woman leapt up as though flung by a crossbow.
"You wretch! Where do you think you're going?"
The servant hurled the words at her as he blocked her path. Stumbling over the corpses, she tried frantically to escape. She attempted to shove past him, but he pushed her back. For a while they grappled in silence among the dead. From the beginning, however, there could be no doubt about the outcome. At last the servant seized her arm and wrenched her to the floor. It was all bone and skin, like the leg of a chicken.
What were you doing? Tell me. If you won't, you'll get this.
The servant thrust her away, drew his sword in a single motion, and held the gleaming white steel before her eyes. Still, the old woman said nothing. Her hands trembled, her shoulders heaved for breath, and her eyes opened so wide that the eyeballs seemed about to burst through the reddened lids. Yet she persisted in silence. At that moment, the servant understood clearly for the first time that her life or death lay entirely in his hands. The realization quietly cooled the hatred that had burned so fiercely within him. What remained was only the calm pride and satisfaction of a task successfully completed. Looking down at the old woman, he softened his voice a little.
I'm no officer of the Imperial Police. I'm only a traveler who happened to pass beneath this gate just now. I have no intention of tying you up or doing anything of that sort. All you have to do is tell me what you were doing up here at this hour.
The old woman opened her already wide eyes still farther and stared fixedly into the servant's face with the sharp gaze of a bird of prey, her eyelids red. Then her wrinkled lips, almost merged with her nose, moved as though she were chewing something. He could see the pointed Adam's apple working in her thin throat. At last, from that throat, a voice like the cry of a crow came to the servant in ragged gasps.
I was pulling out this hair, pulling it out to make a wig.
The servant was disappointed by the unexpected ordinariness of her answer. With that disappointment, his former hatred returned, now joined by cold contempt. The old woman seemed to read his expression. Still clutching in one hand the long strand she had stolen from the corpse's head, she stammered on in a mutter like the croaking of a toad.
Perhaps pulling hair from the dead is a wicked thing. But every corpse here belonged to someone who deserved no better. Take the woman whose hair I was pulling. She used to cut snakes into pieces 4 inches long, dry them, and sell them as dried fish at the palace guards' barracks. If the plague hadn't killed her, she'd still be selling them now. And they say those guards bought them regularly for their meals, because they tasted so good. I don't believe what she did was wicked. She would have starved if she hadn't done it, so she had no choice. And I don't believe what I was doing is wicked either. I too would starve if I did not do it, so I too have no choice. This woman knew very well what it meant to have no choice. I expect she'll forgive what I have done.
That, in essence, was what the old woman said. The servant sheathed his sword and listened coldly, his left hand resting on its hilt. With his right hand, of course, he was again fingering the large, red, pus-filled pimple on his cheek. As he listened, however, a certain courage was born within him, the courage he had lacked earlier beneath the gate. It was also a courage moving in precisely the opposite direction from the courage that had driven him to seize the old woman above it. He no longer wavered between starvation and theft. In his present state of mind, starvation had been expelled so completely from his consciousness that he could scarcely conceive of it.
You're certain of that?
When the old woman finished, the servant pressed the point in a mocking voice. He stepped forward, abruptly took his right hand from the pimple, seized her by the back of her collar, and snarled at her as if to bite.
Then you won't resent me for robbing you. I, too, will starve if I don't.
The servant swiftly stripped the robe from the old woman. When she tried to cling to his legs, he kicked her roughly down onto the corpses. The mouth of the latter was scarcely 5 paces away. Tucking the cypress-brown robe under his arm, he raced down the steep ladder and vanished into the depths of night. Before long, the old woman, who had lain among the corpses as if dead, raised her naked body. Muttering and moaning, she crawled toward the opening of the ladder by the light of the still burning fire. There, with her short white hair hanging downward, she peered below the gate. Outside, there was nothing but black, fathomless night. No one knows where the servant went.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.